In this lecture, we will be attempting to confront the paradox of knowledge, or the paradox of learning, as it is sometimes called. This paradox was perhaps most famously put forth in one of Plato's dialogues, called the Meno dialogue. And so we will be exploring this dialogue of Plato, but we will also be attempting to relate this new theme with what we have covered in the past. And so we will attempt to establish something of a continuity between these lectures. And I think that will be clear, the ways in which this new theme, the way in which it relates and connects to everything that we've covered up until now. The Plato's dialogue, known as the Meno, in the beginning it presents the question of what is virtue. And over the course of the dialogue, this question transforms into the question of what is knowledge, or how is knowledge possible? How is learning possible? To begin with, the two primary characters, Socrates and Meno, they're engaged in a dialogue over the question of virtue itself. Socrates, as usual, he appears as the sort of the one who is wise in his ignorance. Socrates does not presume to know what virtue is. Meno comes across almost as a foil to Socrates. Very, very tellingly, Socrates asks Meno, what is virtue? And Meno replies, the answer to your question will not be difficult at all. This again, it's antithetical to what we've come to understand as the sort of a Socratic approach to knowledge, which is that we, as a condition for learning something, we have to assume that we don't already know it. This will be brought into sharp relief once we encounter the paradox of knowledge, or the paradox of learning. I think already we're confronted with an example or an application of one of the parables that we explored in the very morning hours of this course, and that was, I specifically have in mind Plato's parable of the cave. We concluded that basically the prisoners bind themselves to the cave, or they basically refuse to, because they refuse to relinquish the ideas and the knowledge that they already think they have. They assume that the shadows that they're perceiving, they basically assume that those are reality, and if they encounter another alternative, they reject that alternative because they think they already know. By analogy, it's impossible to grasp something without opening one's fist. So in the same way, once our minds have sort of like latched onto something, we can't receive anything new unless we're willing to open our minds a little bit, to entertain something new. Meno gives the kind of he's a personification of at the very outset of this dialogue. He gives a kind of personification of Plato's hypothetical prisoners in the cave. What I mean by that is he assumes that he already knows what virtue is right from the outset. Again, he's a foil to Socrates. Socrates attempts to inquire into what virtue is. He says, I don't know what it is, but let's explore this together. Meno, on the contrary, tries to answer from the outset. So this is a kind of exemplification, or a more kind of concrete application of how the parable of the cave can help us, can give us insight into concrete situations that we might encounter in our lives. We also can discover again, like an exemplification of the blind man and the elephant, which was another parable that we encountered in the very morning hours of this course. The parable of the blind man and the elephant, this application becomes evident as the dialogue progresses, because the kind of answers that Meno gives to the question, what is virtue, which he presumes to know, he first approaches this by, rather than answering the question as it stood, as Socrates posed it, Meno instead gives lists of virtues, like he gives a sort of catalog of different virtues. And in some ways this is, we find an analogy to this in the blind man and the elephant, because a list of virtues is not the same thing as an explanation for what makes that list, what makes each virtue on that list a virtue in the first place. So one is an example of kind of, the definition or the essence or the logos of virtue. This would be the question that is truly posed, the question that Socrates is asking, the question that Socrates is inquiring into. This is not the same thing as giving a list of virtues or a catalog of virtues, because in the first case you've given the essence of virtue, what makes a virtue virtuous in the first place. In the second case, you've given instances of virtue. Now it's clear that you can derive the second thing from the first thing, but it's not clear that you can derive the first thing from the second thing. This is something that I will pick up on in a moment with another example to show how it's not possible to generalize from instances to a universal. This is intimately related with the problem or the paradox of knowledge, the paradox of learning in the first place. That's something I'll take up presently. As the dialogue progresses, though, the real kind of turning point or the crux of the whole thing comes when Meno finally, in some ways, he gets exasperated. And leading up to this moment, this kind of critical moment in the dialogue, the way in which Socrates has kind of guided him into answering the question differently, and Meno instead, rather than giving a list of virtues, he tries to offer something of a definition of virtue, but he again somehow falls short. And Socrates gives the analogy. He says, what you've said about virtue. And Meno essentially says that to him virtue is basically equivalent with power. So it's being able to govern in a way that helps your friends and harms your enemies. And Socrates says, once again, this by itself, it's clearly falls short of capturing the essence of virtue, because and to have power by itself, it's not the same thing as virtue. And a relevant counterexample would be somebody who uses power for a vicious end. Clearly, you would not call this virtue. Nevertheless, this is entailed by the definition that Meno gives. Socrates says, by analogy, it would be as though you gave me, or I asked the question, what is shape, or what is figure, and you said roundness is figure. And clearly, it's not quite the right way of answering the question, because in a very similar way to in the first case where Meno gave instances, in the second case he's given sort of like one species of shape, or one kind of shape. But again, he's fallen short of even understanding the question as such. He's failed to understand the question because the question is again seeking after the logos, or the essence of shape, and it's not seeking for a particular example or a specific form that essence can take. And at this moment, though, the dialogue really turns. But so summing up, we've kind of encountered the way in which Meno exemplifies both the prisoner at the bottom of the cave, and also the blind man and the elephant. And just to emphasize this point, in the same way that each of the blind men mistook one aspect or one feature of the elephant, for the elephant itself. So in just the same way, Meno has approached virtue from one or another standpoint, but failed to arrive at an understanding of virtue as such. And just as it's, to recapitulate on a suggestion that I made only a few minutes ago, just as it's impossible, as the blind man demonstrated, to arrive at the elephant as such with only having achieved understanding of particular standpoints to that elephant, as the parable of the blind man and the elephant demonstrated. Just as it's impossible to arrive at the elephant by way of those individual standpoints, without first comprehending the elephant as a whole. Yet nevertheless, once we've comprehended the elephant as a whole, then it's very self-evident how each one of those standpoints follows from the elephant as a whole. This again it's the same point as the impossibility of arriving at a definition or an essence from instances of that essence or definition. that it's possible to move from the essence to the instances, but that it's not possible necessarily to move from the instances to the essence. So in the same way, moving from the features of the elephant to the elephant itself is not possible in the same way unless without the precondition of having first grasped the essence of the elephant. This again, perhaps it's somewhat confusing, perhaps it's somewhat abstract. I hope by the end of this lecture I will have given at least one more example, and maybe it will become clearer then. But so at this point, the dialogue really has a kind of a pivotal moment, or the crux of the dialogue comes here, because Meno he turns the tables, and he says, Socrates, you've been criticizing all of the attempts that I've given to answer this question, to provide a definition of justice. You've been criticizing all of these, and yet, nevertheless, and here's the real crux. He says, nevertheless, you profess not to know what virtue is. Now, if that's true, if both of those, if the second thing is true, that you don't know what virtue is, then how can the first thing be true also? In other words, that you're criticizing the definitions that I give. You would have to know what virtue is in order to, recognize the wrong answer or the right answer if it confronted you. If you really don't know what virtue is, then how in the world can you know that my answers are wrong? And Socrates immediately recognizes what's at stake here, what Meno has brought up, because he says, if that's true, what you say, that despite that I don't know what virtue is, that I'm not able to, critique definitions of it. If that's really true, then it must follow from that it's impossible to learn anything at all. It's unlikely that Meno, had this entailment in mind when he made the statement, but nevertheless, it immediately kind of shifts the dialogue into its second part, which is, it's an exploration of learning as such. Like, how would you learn what virtue is unless you already know? And the example used in this case is virtue, but it quickly changes towards to other examples, and in this particular dialogue, it turns towards geometry. But we can spend a moment and try to dwell on try to unpack what's happened, in a very brief span, just a short exchange. Basically, what's at stake is this: it's that how do we learn something that we don't already know? That might seem like, well, the answer somehow might seem obvious, and somehow it might seem just like very self-evident how we learn something. But as always, in the spirit of critical thinking, we're attempting to take a second look at what we might immediately, or on the surface, superficially, we might just take it as a matter of course and just take it for granted that, well, of course I can learn something. But once we inquire more deeply into it, once we think critically, once we think not only once about it, but think about it a second time, suddenly it becomes extremely interesting and somewhat of a mystery. And it's not exactly, this is I think the case, and it's safe as a generalization for all of Plato's dialogues, and perhaps even philosophy as such, where we're not exactly trying to solve problems or solve riddles so much as to sort of reveal questions, reveal mysteries. That's different than solving riddles or solving problems. And I think the critical thinking, the more we apply it, the more we will, the greater number and the greater profundity of mystery that we will just discover everywhere. And learning is a perfect example. And so here's what's at stake. How do we learn something that we don't already know? On the one hand, if we already know something, then it's impossible to learn it. That wouldn't make sense. We can't learn something that we already know. We learn something in the first place because we don't know it. We seek to learn something. On the contrary, and this is what Meno criticized Socrates for, how do we learn something that we don't know? And this comes down to a question of how will we recognize the truth of something that we don't have a standard to measure it against? For example, to use the example from the dialogue, we have a question of virtue. How do we recognize, what's not a virtue or what is a virtue, unless we already somehow know what virtue is? we might say in the beginning, like, well, somebody teaches it to us. But I think it will be only a moment's reflection will reveal that, that doesn't really get around the problem because, well, the same question must be asked. It's like, how do we learn it? It's one thing for somebody to speak words to us, but that by itself is not a sufficient condition for us to understand those words. This is, again, in some ways just an evolution or a metamorphosis of what we encountered in the last lecture, which is how do we transform information into evidence for something? And it's clear that they're not the same thing from the outset. We have to have some kind of concept or theory or understanding or idea that's able to basically recognize or discern or order that information into evidence for something. Well, so how do we arrive at those concepts in the first place? How do we receive those concepts? Because again, we can't just answer that somebody tells them to us, because what people tell us really are basically noises and sounds, right? How is it that we grasp the meaning of those sounds? And you might say, well, one meaning, we learn one meaning from the next one. Just like if you have a question, you can just look it up in the dictionary. And again, that might seem like a satisfactory answer until we think about it critically. But then we realize that, no, because in order to define one thing, you have to make use of, a whole slew of other words. But if you haven't, first grasped those other words, you can't really define anything unless you've already have a handle on meaning, on those words. How do we get that first handle on things? This is something that is suggested in the Meno dialogue in respect to virtue, and then it's more broadly extrapolated to knowledge as such, which is that if we could really grasp one virtue to the hilt, then we would be able to penetrate to the essence of virtue. And similarly, if we could really understand one single word all the way, one single word, one single meaning all the way, we would recognize that single meaning as a sort of aspect of the whole, of the elephant, so to speak. It's, again, these parables, they can give us kind of concrete pictorial form to very abstract speculations. If we think about, if you could really, if one of the blind men had really persisted adamantly to really grasp and really try to perceive what was before his touch, he would have ultimately stumbled on the elephant as a whole. In the same way, if we can really, grasp, if we really grasp the meaning of one single word, it will entail having understood basically the whole world out of which that word emerges. Because to understand a text, you have to understand the context. To understand a word, you have to understand the context around that word, and the context is precisely all of the rest of the language to which that word belongs. Here's an example. We can think of an example of how one thing entails basically everything else. There's a very pithy, almost aphorism from Carl Sagan to communicate the same thing, and it goes roughly something like this. In order to make an apple pie from scratch, you would have to first invent the universe. And so just think about an apple pie, or maybe we can think about the tree from which the apples for the apple pie, the tree that bore those apples. So we've already seen how pie, the concept of pie, apple pie, it relates to the concept of a tree. So already these are two things that we might not have, uncritically we might have imagined they're separate things, but in fact they're related, and they're essentially related. The apples don't come from nothing. They come off of trees, and picture the tree, and you realize just by the single concept of tree, just how much it implicates. And it might be that it implicates everything ever, and it's only the kind of the limitations in our intellect, our intelligence, our reason. It's only the limitations in our reasoning ability that prevent us from seeing the way in which the tree is an expression of the entire universe through all of time. Because if we just think about this, you have a tree, but the tree, it has, just like the elephant, the tree has elements. I'm thinking of, well, on the one hand, you can think of like the trunk and the roots and the branches, the boughs, the leaves, the buds, right? You also have, of course, I said leaves and buds. This is already, spatially you have from the roots to the trunk to the boughs to the leaves, but also through time. So temporally, you have buds that become leaves, right? Blossoms, etc. So you have also synchronically the tree as a kind of image of a tree, but you also have diachronically through time. And so not only do you have that tree, but the tree, every tree was once a sapling. So you have not only the tree at its greatest, maximal manifestation in space, but also you have the tree all the way back to when it was a small tree and a sapling, and just a shoot, and then even a seed. And so then you've already entailed, generations of trees, and in fact, evolution of generations of trees. So you have the genesis of a single tree, but you also have, the generations of many trees through thousands of years, right? And not only this, but in terms of elements, you can think of elements like the trunk and the bark and the roots, etc. Not only this, but you also have elements like periodic elements, so like elements of the periodic table. Already you've implicated, all of the laws of chemistry, and moreover all the laws of physics, which you can easily picture the way that the laws of chemistry are in some ways, expressions of the laws of physics. On top of this, you have the tree, this is kind of going microscopic with the tree, but you can also go macroscopically with the tree and realize that in some ways, just in the same way that water, the chemical composition of water, it's a conjunction of hydrogen with oxygen. Well, in the same way, a tree is a kind of coalescence or composition or concrescence of 1,000 different things, and we can imagine the way that a tree, it joins earth substances, carbon and phosphorus and everything the earth is made of, together with water, like in the sap, and together with sunlight. And you realize that all of those things together, if you took out one of those elements, there would not be a tree in the first place. And so when we look at the tree, in some ways, and this is not just a figurative or a poetic expression, you're literally looking at the sun. You're looking at an expression of the sun. And in the same way that the blind men, they didn't recognize, for example, the ear or the trunk. They didn't recognize that as an expression of the elephant, but nevertheless it was. So in the same way, when we look at a tree, we don't recognize that as a condensation of sunlight. That doesn't mean it isn't. It just means that we lack the insight. We might have the sight to see the tree confronts our eyes, but we might have the sight but not the insight. We have the eyes, but perhaps we don't have the mind or the intelligence yet. But in the spirit of Socrates, we can always be striving to kind of broaden our compass and broaden our scope of insight. So already from a tree, we've moved from the microscopic and down to the atomic, and already to the macroscopic, the solar system. And think of the sun, and it's one of countless stars being born and exploding stars and the birth of stars over thousands and millions of years in the universe, billions of years. Already we can see the way in which to really understand a tree and to not only be able to use the word in a sentence, but really understand the scope, the breadth and scope of what that word truly means, the concept of a tree, what it really is. We've again implicated a large part of the universe, if not the whole thing. And if it doesn't seem like the whole thing, again, this could be limitations in our intelligence and not limitations in the essential relation amongst concepts and amongst meaning in the world. Now, a question is, how do we, this is kind of returning to the more immediate concern of Meno's dialogue, although all of this is implied in Meno's dialogue. Actually, just to kind of put a cap on top of the earlier thought about how one thing in some ways implicates everything else, there's a specific word in Greek that Plato uses in the dialogue of Meno to refer to just this kind of essential common origin of every concept and every meaning that we have. And this word is syngenious. And syngenious, it refers to, syn means sort of together. In Latin, the word might be co or cum, the prefix. In Greek, the words syn or sim means together. You have a symphony, for example, means sounding together. So in the same way, syngenious means the genesis or the origin is the same. And so we might imagine that there's a common origin that we can inquire. If we inquire back and back and back, or into and into and into, then we will arrive at this common origin. But now to return to what occupies the kind of the bulk of the dialogue is this question of the paradox of learning. And again, just kind of briefly stated, it's a question of how do we learn something we don't already know? If we already know it, then we can't learn it. If we don't know it, then we won't recognize the truth when we hear it. And we can think of this in terms of, so we might, at first, a kind of naive answer to the question might be, well, somebody teaches us or somebody tells us. But again, we've revealed that this is insufficient because we already have to have a grasp on the thing to be able to recognize what they're telling us. Right? We already have to have a kind of foothold into this, this source and origin of meaning in order to be able to, apprehend anything at all that somebody tells us or that we see with our eyes. We might say then, we might try a different tact and say, we get a lot of examples or instances of something, and then we can kind of generalize from those instances and grasp the essence. This is maybe, I said that I would try to give a number of examples of this principle and why it's possible to move from the universal to the particular, but not from the particular to the universal. And the reason is because, well, I've given some examples, and I'll try to give another one, and I'll make it as concrete as possible. And in the last lecture, I know that I used a bowl to illustrate a certain concept of how we basically how we transform information, sensory information, into evidence. And in this lecture, I won't use a bowl, but I do have a cup here, and the cup can serve as a kind of a way to illustrate why it's not actually possible to move from the instances to the universal or to the essence, to the definition, in the way we might, naively imagine. Clearly, somehow we overcome this paradox of knowledge, and I will, at the end of the lecture, I will present Socrates' solution, but also, rather than, it's clear that his solution is not exactly, it does far less to solve a riddle than to reveal a mystery. But to return to this cup, how do we know that it's a cup? And we might say, well, I just know. But obviously at some point we had to learn that it was a cup. And then once we think about learning that it's a cup, again we stumble upon this paradox of learning, which is, if we already knew it was a cup, how did we learn? But if we didn't know that it was a cup, how did we learn? And we might say, and again, we've already attempted to answer solve the problem by saying, well, somebody told us. But again, that's not sufficient. And so then we might say, well, maybe, somebody lined up a bunch of cups for us. We had a whole lineup of cups. And we looked at all those cups, and maybe there was 10, and maybe there was 20, or maybe there was 100. And we said, okay, and we sort of, in our minds, made an abstraction of the common element. And so we looked at all the cups and made a kind of generality of a cup. The reason that, and this might initially seem, very plausible, and in fact, most of us kind of, and largely, at least, in the early stages of the scientific method, this is called, the inductive method. It was articulated by Francis Bacon, and he had the idea that, we don't have to, we can arrive at general principles, general laws of nature by what he called induction, which is moving from, examples and instances, and you gather enough instances together, and, the general principle that those instances are expressing, it will become self-evident through those instances. It's not sufficient, though, and this takes a little bit of. It only takes an instant of reflection here, but it can be sometimes hard to arrive at that instant. And the problem at stake is that suppose you gather a bunch of instances of a cup, or anything for that matter. You are already presupposing the thing that you are ostensibly trying to learn from those instances. In other words, in order to recognize instances as instances in the first place, you have to already know the principle or the universal or the definition or the idea of what those instances are. And so you could never recognize the commonality amongst 100 cups unless you already knew what cup was. And you might say, well, you can just point to it, but no, because what are you pointing to? Unless you know what a cup is, you might think of it as a bowl, or you might think of it as that they're pointing to, I don't know, ceramics, or hardness, or roundness, or colors, etc. There's some kind of mystery that we're able to, again, kind of through intuition, grasp actual meanings like structures of meaning, configurations of understanding, ideas, concepts, universals. These are all more or less synonyms. Definition, logos. The sort of provision of solution that Socrates gives to this question of the paradox of learning is he says, it's true that none of the ordinary explanations that we would try to give, it's true that none of them is satisfactory. And so he says, suppose that it's like this. Suppose that all learning is in fact a form of recollection. And he says, imagine one time that the mind or the soul, that it was possessed of all knowledge, like it knew everything, it was omniscient in some way. And then we merely forget. But when we learn something, we think we're learning something new. In fact, we're recollecting something that we once knew. And this, of course, it gets around a number of the problems that we've been confronted with, because we don't seem to encounter the same difficulty when we're reaching back to remember something, we immediately know whether the memory is correct. And in fact, this comparison of knowledge or learning to memory, it's a good one for a number of reasons. One of them is at least two reasons come to mind, and I'll describe one of them as, or I'll label one of them as roughly, sort of factual, and the second one I'll label as roughly phenomenological. And I'll explain what I mean by the second one first, the phenomenological reason that the comparison of memory to knowledge is a very good one. And that's because it's really obvious that if you try to imagine the sum total of your knowledge, you realize that there's no single point in time that it's all sort of arrayed before you. Rather, in order to grasp some knowledge, even if you already have that knowledge, you have to recollect that knowledge. And again, if this weren't the case, then I don't see how that it would be possible to go through life, because everything that you had ever known would always be kind of present for you in your mind. And it's clear that we have to in some ways like provisionally forget things in order to go about our days, in order to learn anything new. Certainly, you can't have all of the content of your mind before you at every moment. So we're already in some ways ultimately dependent on proper recollection for anything that we know, whether this is like the Pythagorean theorem or what a tree is, for example, anything at all. We depend on being able to remember what we had once learned. And so in that way, I guess I've already kind of, in preparing the ground to describe what I mean by the phenomenological aspect of why memory is a good comparison with knowledge, I've kind of already explained what I mean by the factual reason. And that's again that in some ways knowledge as such, and certainly grasping knowledge, is it's factually reliant on the same process that is operative in all in recollection, in memory. And then I will just point out the phenomenological relation between those two things. And by phenomenological, I just mean the kind of experiential. And it's very obvious that both when we learn something new, which is not the same thing as acquiring information, and I hope that this is the reason that these are not the same thing is clear from the last two lectures. But just to recapitulate, information as such is not the same thing as understanding. It's not the same thing as evidence. In order to transform information into understanding, there's a certain it's an experience of kind of like insight, and we almost, if it had a sound, it would be like aha, like now I see. Again, aha really captures it. We have a sort of inner sense for correctness or inner sense for truth. When we see suddenly something goes from not making sense to suddenly there's a transformation, and suddenly, aha, it makes sense. It's a kind of epiphany, like a moment of epiphanic moment. And this can be on a very small scale, all the way to a real epiphany where you fall down on your knees, and etc. But it's the same, this aha moment. We have the same experience when we are reaching, like searching for memory. And we always know when we have grasped the right one. And because we can discard memories that are not the one we're looking for. And again, we have a sense of kind of arriving or recognition or aha moment when we arrive at the proper memory. And so again, kind of experientially, the sort of insight into truth, like again, knowledge or perception, insight, understanding is not the same thing as merely receiving information. It's rather, or facts, right? It's rather recognizing the truth in those facts, or recognizing understanding those facts. And again, in that moment of recognition, in that moment of understanding, we have a sense of aha-ness. And in just the same way, we have that sense of aha-ness when we are able to recollect something that we're searching for. And so again, phenomenologically, they're very similar, if not identical. And so I kind of covered why they're factually similar or even identical, and also phenomenologically identical. And so again, just to recapitulate, factually, we can't have all of our knowledge before us at every moment in time, certainly, and even at any moment in time. At any moment in time, our mind is occupied with a small sliver out of the compass of everything that we know. In order to move from one thing that we know to another thing, it involves forgetting what we're thinking on presently and recollecting something else that we weren't thinking on at that moment. And so again, knowledge relies on memory, and then in the same way, it has the same quality. To remember something and to learn something has the same quality, a sense of kind of epiphany or insight. The reason, and so now just to conclude, again, so this is the answer that Socrates gives, and I look at it more as, rather than, again, kind of like giving the answer to a question, it's rather serving to illuminate the profundity of the question. Because I think it will also be clear that just appealing to recollection, if anything, it kind of magnifies the mystery. And what I mean is that it's a profound mystery to consider consider the nature of that sort of inner sense for truth. And the inner sense for truth, it lights up, and we know it lights up when we have the experience of insight or the aha moment. How do we, for example, when we're recollecting something, when we're remembering something, how is it that we're able to discriminate false memories from proper ones? And again, we can't always do this. Sometimes we make mistakes, but the fact that we're able to, recognize mistakes in the first place, the fact that we know we make mistakes, that already presumes that, often that to be able to identify a mistake presumes that you're able to do something correctly. And so in the same way, we know that sometimes memory fails us, but as a condition to know that, we also must assume that it often works. But that's the true mystery. It's how are we able to when we're trying to remember something, how are we able to discard false memories, and how are we able to recognize the right one when it lands on us, when we land on it, or when it lands on us? And again, it's a kind of intuitive sense for truth that we're appealing to, that it's very hard to explain other than just pointing to it and saying somehow you know it when you experience it. But the problem, or the real mystery comes when we say, again, we sort of pose the Socratic question to it, which is, or it's actually in this dialogue, Meno puts it forth, so it's maybe the Platonic question, which is, if we don't already know what we're trying to remember, if we haven't already in some ways remembered what we're trying to remember, because again, we've sort of established the identity of recollection and knowledge, if we don't already somehow know what it is we're trying to remember, then how do we remember it in the first place? If we do already remember it, then how do we remember it? Because, again, you don't remember something you already remember. You wouldn't bother. And so there's again, I hope that some of these thoughts in the lecture, rather than sort of give us a feeling that we can, I don't know, just kind of, wash our hands and say, okay, now we've solved this mystery. I don't think it's that way at all, and I hope that, if anything, that this lecture has, just put before us, further questions, further opportunities for exploration, and so this is probably a good place to stop, and so I will end this lecture now, but I will not end before wishing everyone the very best, and until next time.